5 years ago today, on the dot, December 18th, 2017, Bryanstars would upload his final video. From a once prominent creator with the world in his eyes to a cold husk of his former self. What went wrong with Bryanstars? Hello everybody. The rise and fall genre is extremely oversaturated. However, a certain YouTuber has slipped through the cracks, a YouTuber that was at one point my favorite, Bryanstars. Unless you were an emo loser in the early 2010s like I was, you probably think you've never heard the name Bryanstars, but you have. You may be shocked to know that a YouTuber who exploited minors for money, forcing those minors to perform sexually suggestive acts in YouTube videos, borderline sexually harassing people in his videos, and even covering up for registered convicted sex offender Austin Jones, has only been covered in length once. The only rise and fall video I've seen about Bryanstars is a video by the Cozy Representative. I'll leave a link to his video in the description since he was kind of the first person to do a rise and fall on Bryanstars. But other than that, it doesn't seem like any of the popular rise and fall content creators have actually talked about Bryan. The story of Bryanstars has stayed strictly within the emo scene community. You may be confused how a guy like this is a prominent figure in a community like that, but it'll all make sense very, very soon. Bryanstars, full name Bryan Odell, was born on May 22nd, 1990 in Sendai, Japan. So obviously Bryanstars is not Japanese, but he lived in Japan because that's where his parents worked, and he even says by the age of 3 he could speak English and Japanese pretty well. Bryan was very happy in Japan. In a Draw My Life video, he referenced this time as the happiest years of his life. However, Bryan's dreams of finding a kawaii waifu were cut short, and at the age of 8, he and his family moved to Texas, where he traded in his isekai lifestyle for the chance to meet a muscular tomboy instead. Not a bad trade-off, to be honest. I mean, it could have been worse. Bryan moved a few times throughout the next few years, from Texas to Nebraska. He referenced his middle school and high school years as not great. He was bullied throughout his adolescence. He specifically struggled a lot in his early years in America because he didn't speak English fluently and wasn't super in touch with American culture. And honestly, it sounds like a really challenging thing to go through, to be the curly-headed blonde kid who can barely speak English with a Japanese accent, and probably made him a super easy target overall, and it must have been really challenging at such a young age, and I do genuinely feel for him on that. Eventually, Bryan developed an interest in news and journalism. In high school, he made a documentary about the energy crisis in America, where he won 3rd place in a competition at his high school. This competition was hosted by C-SPAN, and Bryan was given $1,000 and had his documentary broadcasted on national television. When he went to college, he started doing an internship with NBC, where he would interview musicians at local shows. And now this is where Bryan's story truly begins. Bryan rose to prominence on YouTube because he interviewed, bands in the emo scene, metalcore, hardcore, Warped Tour community. So I'm not going to go through every fucking interview he did, every subscriber milestone and all that shit, because it's unnecessary and it would take forever. But I do want to explain what these interviews were like if you weren't familiar. I'm also going to be speaking on the interviews based on how they were perceived at the time, because the narrative has shifted a lot on whether or not these interviews were actually good, but at the time, pretty much everyone loved them. And I'm personally of the belief that a majority of the band members genuinely enjoyed doing interviews with Bryan. Whether they were laughing with him or at him is yet to be determined, but they did enjoy it at the very least. But I watched tons of Bryanstars interviews with Asking Alexandria, Black Veil Brides, Falling in Reverse, and Sleeping with Sirens, and all those fucking bands that remind me of the time that I was kissless and only slightly more depressed than I am now. Bryanstars was a black sheep in the best way possible. I mean, look at him. The curly blonde locks, no tattoos, and that crusty unwashed blue Aeropostale shirt. Mwah. Perfection. Bryan embraced the fact that he was different. He asked ridiculous questions to the band members, and I think the goal was to let the band members come out of their shell. When band members were doing 3 interviews a day answering the same questions, they started to develop ways to answer those questions and just were like robots in the interview. Most of these interviews were so fucking dry, like how's the tour, how are the shows been, like what's going on with the new album, what's your favorite tattoo, just like the same questions over and over. I even remember when this one guy was interviewing Austin Carlisle from Of Mice and Men, and he asked what his mom thinks about his career, not knowing that his mom is fucking dead.
What about your mom? My mom passed away when I was 17.
So it was nice that Bryan was giving band members the opportunity to let loose and catch them off guard with weird questions and show their personalities to their fans. But it's weird because Bryan somehow had the clarity to know that in a saturated market of band interviews that you had to break the mold a little bit, but for some reason the only thing he could think of doing different was essentially sexually harassing the people he was interviewing.
What is it like to be arguably the most beautiful lead singer in the metalcore genre? I actually got you something. It's been such an honor to have you here. I got you some flowers. This is actually to award you for being the most beautiful lead singer.
Bryan's most iconic question is, if you were a porn star, what would your porn star name be and what would your catchphrase be? Which is a funny, interesting question, I suppose, and a question that they probably wouldn't hear from any other interviewer, but a lot of his joke questions were kind of just like homoerotic and hypersexual. I guess the idea was to loosen the band members up so they could be themselves and be goofy, and it's a great idea, but I can think of tons of ways to ask weird questions without being fucking gay about it. If you could be any character in a movie, who would it be and why? What's your favorite block in Minecraft? What's your favorite potion brewing ingredient in Skyrim, and why is it the fungal swamp pod? And then, you know, you could throw in the question, hey, what's your porn star name? It seems like Bryan's questions were like 70% gay jokes, 10% jokes that weren't sexual in nature, and 20% like actual serious questions. It's worth mentioning that a lot of the bands he would interview actually seemed to not be too bothered, and I honestly chuckled a bit watching some of these interviews. I mean, these interviews were some of my favorite videos on YouTube at the time. The interviews with Andy Biersack from Black Veil Brides, Danny and Ben from Asking Alexandria. I even checked out some old interviews of bands that I started liking after the Bryanstars era, like Volumes, for example, and that interview was pretty funny too. But it is also worth mentioning that in all of the interviews, and I mean all of them, there were at least a few moments in them where the band members would be verbally and physically uncomfortable. On top of that, the band members would occasionally just bully the fuck out of Bryan in like an innocent way. They kind of treated him like an annoying little brother. So there's a specific reason that I wanted to explain like what kind of questions he was asking, because it's a precursor of the future of Bryanstars, which is just very hypersexual content. So Bryanstars' audience, as well as the audience of these emos, screamo, post-hardcore, whatever the fuck bands, consisted of underage girls that were like 12 to 15. So the girls watching these videos, they were fine with it. They didn't see anything wrong with it, and I didn't either. I was around that age as well when I watched his videos. But after hundreds of interviews, it was only a matter of time before somebody snapped. Christopher Drew is the singer for the band Never Shout Never. Bryan, very early in his career, interviewed Chris, and it was a fantastic interview. It was one of his best performing interviews, even to this day. Bryanstars was doing very well and eventually got lots of attention, so much that the New York Times wanted to cover one of his interviews. And what better band to cover than Never Shout Never? Chris and Bryan seemed to have great chemistry. The previous interview did really well, and people wanted another. It was perfect. Right?
Hey, what's up, you guys? We're hanging out here with Never Shout Never.
I think I heard about you starting some rumors about us that we broke up. When are we gonna start talking about music? Because that's what we're all about. Well, I'd like to start now.
Let's see. Nope.
We're not about any bullshit. We're just about real deal stuff.
Are you mad at me because of the Rest in Peace Never Shout Never video?
You are trying to make a mockery of all the bands that you're interviewing. These questions are ridiculous, dude. We don't really want to talk about this type of things. These guys don't appreciate questions that are bullshit because these guys are real musicians. I don't know if you know that.
I've asked him 2 questions and he hasn't given me an answer.
Well, because you've been weird about it, man. Realness isn't always just happy-go-lucky questions or answers, you know? It's real shit, you know? And if you want to be a part of that real shit, you can, or you can, you know, keep being a joke, you know? It's up to you.
It's kind of frustrating to see how people view this video in modern times. People say things like, oh, Chris saw through Bryan and we should have seen the signs ahead of time. Fuck that, okay? I'm gonna be plenty critical of Bryan in this video, but this is not the time. Bryan drove 7 fucking hours to interview Chris, and it was at this point his most important interview yet, and Chris was a total fucking asshole to him, as well as the other members of the band too. Never Shout Never knew what they were getting into. Everyone in the scene knew what to expect from a Bryanstars interview, and Chris is no exception. Chris later went to Twitter and blamed being on acid during the interview as why he was such a dick, which, to be fair, I wouldn't be surprised if he was on acid because he was acting a little bit weird. But I guess I'd have to say to that, why the fuck would you take acid before an interview that not only did Bryan drive 7 hours to do, but was being covered by a huge media company and was insanely extremely important to Bryan. Bryan would have just interviewed like Andy Biersack again or something. That would have been a fantastic interview. I mean, Andy is a sweet guy. Fuck, Andy Biersack was even nice to Onision. The interview was a shit show, but the internet had Bryan's back. And so did a few members from the bands he interviewed, like Andy Biersack from Black Veil Brides, Chris Franzak from Attila, Kellen Quinn from Sleeping with Sirens, Matt Trainer from Bless the Fall. Like I said, Chris eventually apologized. He blamed it on acid, which not only doesn't excuse you from being a dick, but it makes you a careless dick. At the end of the interview, you can see Bryan like visibly upset. He's crying. He's fucking humiliated, and I don't care what you have to say, he didn't deserve that shit. But fortunately for Bryan, this entire drama or issue or whatever galvanized his supporters. And this is when Bryanstars started to become like a celebrity in the scene hardcore and emo community. In the behind the scenes footage for Bryanstars interviews moving forward, he was constantly being approached by fans. People were so excited to see him, and he was even getting chants from the crowds. This is something that's really hard to put into words if you weren't there, but Bryanstars was an enigma. Like, if you saw a tall, gangly, pasty, blonde-haired kid with a blue Aeropostale shirt at these shows, it was Bryanstars. It wouldn't be anybody else. It was Bryan. And this is a point that the Cozy representative made in his video. There was nobody like Bryanstars. The interviews and the look and the awkward mannerisms, like, he was a character. He was an icon, and he was arguably bigger than a lot of the individual band members that he would interview. I remember seeing Bryan at Warped Tour 2015. I was pretty upset with him, but regardless of that, I was like stunned to see him in person. Of course, I didn't talk to him. It was mainly because I was sketched out by his relationship with a certain individual that I'm going to talk about right now. So in late 2012, Bryanstars was on top. He was doing interviews, and later he would announce his Bryanstars tour. The Bryanstars tour featured some bands across the country, and it gave people the opportunity to meet Bryan for the first time. This was a really, really good idea. I can't stress that enough, because the thing is that nobody could really meet Bryan at this point unless they were in his area going to a show that he happened to be interviewing for. So this gave people across the country the opportunity to meet their favorite YouTuber. So the tour itself isn't entirely important to the story of Bryanstars, except for the fact that a certain person comes into frame, arguably the most important person in the story aside from Bryan. Bryan would hire a young man named Johnny Gilbert to run the merch stand for his tour. Johnny was only 15 years old at this time. Johnny was and is a good-looking guy. He's got the cute emo soft boy look with the squirrel hat and the face paint, and Bryanstars' community, like I said earlier, was young teenage girls, emo girls, who love emo boys. The community fell in love with Johnny. I mean, he was and still is a really sweet guy. And so Bryan would slowly start to integrate Johnny into the content. Bryan would start to distance himself from doing interviews to doing more normie content like challenges and skits and stuff. Down the line, Bryan would realize that there were more emo teenagers on YouTube that he could capitalize on. And so now we enter the beginning of the end of Bryanstars. MyDigitalEscape is a YouTube channel created by Bryanstars on November 28th, 2014, which featured him as well as 6 other YouTubers. The original members were Bryan, of course, Johnny, obviously, as well as Alex Dorami, I don't fucking know, Jordan Sweeto, Kyle David Hall, as well as Alex Ramos, who at the time was my favorite Viner. And fun fact, I even played Advanced Warfare with him on my Xbox. But the last original member, I can't find much trace of on the channel. This is somebody that I know you know. Another crucial player in the downfall of Bryanstars. None other than convicted sex offender, Austin fucking Jones. MyDigitalEscape was a channel of 7 members, each responsible for posting 1 video a week on their respective days. Every day there was a video, and every week there was a new theme. Or at least that's the original model. It might have changed, I don't fucking remember. Anyways, Alex Ramos didn't stay for long. He wasn't good with uploading, and I don't know if he just quit or if he got the boot, but he was eventually replaced by Shannon Taylor. And Jaden Wales replaced Austin Jones early on in the channel, or maybe it was the other way around. I really don't know. It's hard to figure out this information with all the deleted videos and lack of archives. Also, I had no clue until I did research for this video, but apparently Jaden is trans, and currently he's 2 years post-op and goes by Luke now, so congrats, buddy. Looking good, friend. So anyways, MDE's content was pretty mediocre. It certainly wasn't my cup of tea. I thought it was really fucking cringe. I was 17 at the time. I mean, I followed Bryan for interviews, and on top of the fact that the interviews were not a thing anymore, I was also moving away from bands like Black Veil Brides and Asking Alexandria. I was moving more towards melodic and progressive metalcore bands like August Burns Red and Bless the Fall and Ocean's 8 Alaska. I was never into MyDigitalEscape. I did subscribe and would check out the channel because I wanted to support Bryan, and I thought it was cool that he was trying to branch out. But yeah, it was fucking talk shit. Another thing worth mentioning is that Bryan's iconic image began to change. He grew his hair out, straightened it, and he even traded in those iconic blue Aeropostale t-shirts for band merch and graphic tees. Maybe you think this isn't a big deal, and maybe you think I'm mentioning it just because it's funny. I mean, to be fair, it is fucking funny. It's fucking hilarious. In fact, I got blocked by Bryanstars when he debuted his new look, which, holy fucking shit, Bryan. I'm not gonna say anything, but did you even brush your hair before taking this picture? Like, what happened? Like, for fuck's sakes, my emo hair when I was 14 looks better than this. But for real, Bryan's look was so iconic. One of the biggest reasons he was so iconic was because he stuck out like a sore thumb. Being emo was all about being different, but ironically, the nerdy kid wearing an Aeropostale shirt was what was different in that community. Bryan was the black sheep of this community, which was cool because the people who would watch the videos were black sheep in their own lives, so you could look at this person who was different and relate to them still. But then it's almost like Bryan became a normie by becoming emo. I mean, Bryan is free to do whatever he wants as long as it's legal. And I do think he was kind of put into a box where he felt like he had to wear the Aeropostale shirts. He had to keep his hair short. So I understand him wanting to break free of that mold, but it seemed like it was a business move. And you'll learn why I think that as we watch Bryan plummet. Because something happened in between the inception of MyDigitalEscape and the fall, and it may be potentially the worst thing Bryan has ever done. I'm sure you know the story, but I'm just gonna go over it real fucking quick, but from the perspective of Bryanstars. Essentially, Austin Jones was a YouTube-based pop star. Very talented, very cool, very swag. I don't like it. Because Austin was exposed for attempting to solicit explicit pictures from underage girls around 14 to 15 years old. Austin would also give them twerking tutorials.
Hey cutie, so this is like the first basic twerk move.
In a world of goobers, Austin is the goofiest.
Instead of clapping them, how about you just spread your cheeks for 10 seconds then? Would that be easier? Your wedgie has to be good enough so that when you spread your cheeks, it shows the edges of your butthole. OMG, that would be so funny. I know you're trying your hardest to prove you're my biggest fan, and I don't want to have to find someone else. Like, as soon as you spread them, OMG, we'll both laugh. I'm trying to help you so much. I have to see your butthole to know for sure that you care 100%. I bet you had no idea that when you met me just one day later, you get to show me your butthole. How special do you feel? Okay, go make it clap super loud and talk about your age the whole time, got it? Clap it super loud and say these lines. I'm only 14. Yeah, only 14 years old. This ass is only 14 years old.
You are a fucking creature, Austin. Anyways, Austin was exposed for this and he made a statement where he was pretty much just like, oh, my sister's dead and I don't know my dad and my house caught on fire and I cut myself and my life is tragic and that's why I'm sexting minors and fucking twerking on camera. Fuck you, Austin. That's not even a good reason to be emo. It just sounds like an anime origin story. Long story short, Austin was set to go on the Vans Warped Tour with Bryan, Johnny, Jordan, Austin, and D Fizzy, who is also very crucial to the story. The Vans Warped Tour, by the way, is like a staple experience of any emo or hardcore kid. It's like a coming of age thing, pretty much. When D Fizzy, or Damon, aka the Giga Chad of the story, called this out, things got really fucking ugly. I even decided to boycott Warped Tour after this disaster. I mean, I still went that year, so I'm kind of lying. I already bought the tickets, so yeah, but I didn't go after. Essentially, Damon didn't want to go on tour with him. There was tons of underage girls at Warped Tour, and he didn't want to be in a bus with a pedophile. It's just sounds like a really bad combo, obviously. He called all of it out and he got kicked off of Warped Tour and was called a bully, and people were saying that he was slandering Austin Jones for calling out Austin for asking for butthole pictures of minors and asking them for twerking videos. It's fucking insane. But at the end of the day, from what I remember, neither Austin or Damon ended up on the tour. Now, what does this have to do with Bryan? Well, Damon has gone on record to clarify that Bryan was in Austin Jones's ear, giving him advice on how to get out of this. Bryan was Austin Jones's manager, and when Damon found out about the allegations, he brought him up to Bryan, and Bryan very quickly changed the subject, which I don't know how the fuck you pivot out of a conversation like that, but good job, Bryan. He didn't care if minors were getting groomed or even assaulted. He just wanted the commission he'd get from Austin Jones and the money he'd make from Warped Tour. But yeah, maybe you didn't know that this rise and fall would actually include the rise and fall of one of the most prominent sexual predators in YouTube history. I mean, this guy is arguably worse than EDP, and Bryan was in his ear the whole time. He was downplaying serious allegations, and he was jeopardizing the safety of his own fans for money. But it keeps getting crazier. Apparently, an associate of Bryan's management company named Dan was with Austin Jones when he was fucking arrested in an airport. Right before he was sentenced, to a minimum of 10 years in prison. Bryanstars tried to cover the tracks of a felon and registered sex offender. But Bryan wasn't just willing to overlook the abuse of his fans. He even did it to his own friends. Eventually, all of the members of the aforementioned MyDigitalEscape would join forces, all in the same room for a week of content called 7 for 7 week. According to one of the members, Shannon, Bryan ruled with an iron fist. No one was allowed to come up with ideas for the content, which is just insane because I imagine the other members probably had some decent ideas for videos and Bryan was just like, no, we're gonna do the fucking leaf blower challenge. Also, according to Shannon, Bryan told all the members one day that they had to film a video about depression. Had to film a video. Shannon referenced this as selling suicide, which definitely makes sense because being depressed is pretty common in emo culture, obviously, and tons of fans would eat that shit up. But that's also obviously fucked up because a lot of the people in MyDigitalEscape deal with depression and they didn't want to talk about it because they had to or for money. They wanted to talk about it when they were in the proper headspace and felt like there was things to say about it. Shannon also says that in a now deleted video she was slapped in the face with a dildo during 7 for 7 week, which she said made her very uncomfortable as someone who was sexually assaulted multiple times in her life. And I think we could all understand somebody not liking being slapped in the face with a dildo even without being sexually assaulted previously. Oh yeah, you also may be asking, why the fuck was Shannon slapped in the face with a dildo? Well, it's mainly because MyDigitalEscape's content was very hypersexual and even treaded into queerbaiting territory. Remember that thing I mentioned earlier about Bryan seeming to think that comedy is when you act gay and talk about sex all the time? That's pretty much what MDE's humor was. There was jokes about different male members having a secret gay relationship and they would clickbait kissing videos and all this different shit. So I'm not gonna sit here and act like queerbaiting is like the biggest atrocity ever, but it's fucking cringe. And so is constantly making sex jokes with people that are as young as 7 years your junior and barely legal. In fact, while I'm on the subject, some MDE videos featured Kyle and Johnny when they were under 18 reenacting things that I'm personally not comfortable with showing, but they're very sexual in nature. And if you know my content, it should be very shocking that I'm not willing to show whatever the fuck they were doing. For fuck's sakes, he forced Johnny and Alex to have their first kiss on camera when they were minors and they weren't even dating yet, and their first kiss was for a fucking YouTube video. So as you can guess, 7 for 7 week ended in disaster. No one wanted to be there. In fact, Shannon says,
7 out of 7 week was the first time that I realized there were huge problems. As soon as I met everyone and we were all in one room, in one setting, I realized we were fucked. You know, during 7 out of 7 week, everyone literally was just like, this is not okay, this is weird, these videos aren't the stuff that we're making on our own time, and we brought it up in a group discussion that ended up getting really violent and heated, not physically violent, but screaming and everything, and the final results from the person in charge of the channel was, if it's not broke, don't fix it.
The other members were forced to remedy the situation and pretty much disregard their own feelings for the sake of Bryan. These people, by the way, once again, are 6 to 7 years younger than Bryan, which certainly speaks to the level of maturity they were dealing with when it comes to Bryan. Later down the line of MDE, they would embark on a tour much like the Bryanstars tour. Only one problem. No one was ready for it. Nobody had a say on whether this tour happened or not, other than Bryan. Bryan forced these guys to go on tour across the country. What made it worse is that not all of them made music, but they all had to do a performance, which apparently was really stressful and difficult to deal with for some of the members. I mean, I don't know why. It doesn't make any sense to me. Also, speaking of music, around this time, very conveniently, Bryan released his own EP. Wait, what was it called again? Follow Your Dreams, released March 21st, 2016, right around the time the tour was starting. So this music was horseshit. It was fucking terrible. Bryan is a very mediocre, subpar singer at best. Anyways, Bryan was a train wreck on tour. Shannon, as well as Kyle, would apparently try to talk to Bryan daily about the things that they were going through and how uncomfortable they were with the situation. They tried to voice their concerns and it fell on deaf ears, and according to Shannon, the other members were too scared to confront him. At the end of the MyDigitalEscape tour, Bryan did what any rational person would do in a heated situation like this. He fucking fired everyone. Bryan then uploaded a video with Johnny and Alex announcing the end of MyDigitalEscape. Bryan seemed to be the most talkative. I wonder why. Maybe it's because he had the most to gain and still had something to lose, as opposed to Alex and Johnny, who had pretty much the only thing in their life taken away from them. And I need to stress this, they were fired right after being essentially kidnapped and financially abused into doing this tour. So it makes sense that they were insanely fucking depressed and bummed out. I mean, they barely want to look at the camera. And Johnny just doesn't have like the spunk in his voice that he normally does. It's fucking sad. But at least that's all over. These guys can put Bryan in the past, right? Right?
Whoa, look at these colors! New MyDigitalEscape 2.0, featuring that guy who plays Apex Legends now, the guy who can't stop fucking women that aren't his girlfriend, and... I'm not gonna make a joke about this one.
4 months later, MyDigitalEscape 2.0 was announced. The only trace of this that I can find is the tweet announcing it, where a bunch of people in the comments are telling Bryan to go fuck himself. So Bryan took the channel that all of them worked so hard to build, and he just got new members. It was the same channel with like 800,000 subscribers or something like that. But it didn't pan out at all. In fact, I don't even think new videos were uploaded with the new members. But a big part of the backlash was after Johnny, Alex, and Shannon made videos speaking out about this. And this is where like all the information about Bryan being a shitty person kind of came to light. I watched all 3 of these videos, and I'm going to try to give the best summary of what they were saying. This is like an hour's worth of footage of them kind of shooting off in different directions, which I'm not shitting on them for, by the way. It was a very stressful situation. They wanted to get the videos out fast. Their minds were racing, and guess what? Bryan was threatening to sue them at this point. Bryan didn't want the former members of MyDigitalEscape to slander him. And if we've learned anything from this video, slandering is when you tell the truth. In summary, the 3 former members said that Bryan viewed them as tools. They weren't friends, they were just dollar signs, even saying it was like working in a factory. Shannon mentions those things I mentioned earlier about the queer baiting and the hypersexual content. She even says that the analytics showed that the average viewers for MDE were 12 to 15-year-old girls. So that's not good stuff to be showing them. She also mentioned things about how terrible 7 for 7 week was, the dildo slapping, and like the forced depression videos. If you're gonna watch any of the videos, I would suggest you watch Shannon's. It's the longest, but it's the most detailed, and she stays relatively composed. She did a good job. But the main theme of these videos were we were treated like shit, we were not valued, Bryan squeezed us dry, he dumped us off, and then once the dust settled, he started a brand new channel with new people. Or it wasn't even a new channel, it was the same channel, just with different members. And they weren't allowed to do anything about it because Bryan owned 100% of the channel. Now, you may think this is stupid drama, like, why does it matter? He's just rebooting the channel that he owns, like, they don't have any legal right to it, blah, blah, blah. And you're right, I guess, it is kind of stupid. But imagine being in your late teens, being treated like a factory worker, having limited creative freedom, sacrificing working on your own channel, being degraded and humiliated, being dragged onto a tour and being bullied by a guy way older than you, all for you to be dumped out like you're trash. It's fucked. It's completely fucked up. At this point, it wasn't looking good for Bryan. Bryan released an apology. It was fucking dog shit. I don't know. So at this point, there's only one more thing that happened with Bryan. At the lowest point of your career, what can you possibly do to fix things?
My name is Bryan, and I am gay.
Ah, of course. Raise up that marginal shield of yours, Bryan. This is so fucking scummy. I don't think Bryan wanted to come out for any other reason than the fact that no one can say anything negative to the person coming out of the closet. Bryan was starved for positivity at this point, and I think the only way that he could post a video without getting tons of negative comments if he was just like, hey, I'm fucking gay, dude. I like dicks in my ass, dude. You can't bully me when I got a dick in my ass. How fucking convenient is that, Bryan? Anyways, it got to this point where Bryan wasn't relevant anymore in a positive or negative sense. He rarely did challenge videos, he didn't have friends or minors to sexually exploit in skits, and he didn't have the confidence to do interviews anymore. At this point, all he could do was his least popular content, which was talk about news in the scene, which was pretty hard to scrape together into a consistent schedule. And his final video was uploaded today, 5 years ago, December 18th, 2017.
The reason I wanted to do this is because I wanted to, you know, do something with my life. And people have told me that my videos help them get through a bad day, and you know, I just wanted to do something cool with my life.
Bryanstars, 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 Bryanstars.
This video is cold, it's lifeless, and Bryan seems cold and lifeless too. He doesn't have friends, he doesn't have an audience that loves him anymore, and it seems like along the way he lost the real Bryan. I think Bryan was alone his entire life. Like, he was just bullied relentlessly all throughout his childhood, and he clawed his way into doing a career that he loved, and he found a group of people who loved him, and he found friends, and he found the confidence to be who he wanted to be. I think that's really cool. But I also think that Bryan developed a bit of a god complex, and if I'm being honest, he kind of was a god. In the cringiest way possible, he was a god. I mean, like I said, Bryanstars was a celebrity. He was an icon. He was so successful, and sometimes he was even more successful than the individual members that he was interviewing. And when you spend your whole life as nobody and then you become something greater than yourself, I think you're gonna lose yourself along the way. Like I said, I saw Bryan at 2015 Warped, and it was surreal to see this person. Even though I was angry at him, I didn't know he was covering up for Austin Jones, but I didn't like the fact that he wasn't speaking up for Damon and wasn't speaking out against Austin. I could also tell that at that point, Johnny was just a prop for Bryan. He was just a cute emo boy to help him sell tickets and get clicks for his thumbnails. I really wanted to say hi to Johnny because Johnny was right next to him when I saw Bryan, but I didn't. Because I knew I'd have to talk to Bryan if I went up to Johnny, and I didn't have the balls at the time to call Bryan out to his face. And I really wish I did. But for some reason, like, I feel bad for Bryan, which is not a popular opinion, but I feel bad for him. I don't know if he actually is a bad person or if he just became a bad person. He got so high on his ego. I watched Bryan because I was a sad, emo, loser teenager like everyone else who watched his videos. I was a broken and tortured soul, and I was a beautiful flower waiting to blossom. It's cringe, but that's what I was. I didn't have friends because I didn't deserve to have friends, and the only people that I had in my life were the YouTubers I watched and the musicians that I listened to. And Bryan brought those two things together. And it was really fucking cool. And I think the biggest reason that I'm mad at Bryan is because he took that away from me. He took away a part of my childhood. And I can't watch those old videos anymore. It just doesn't feel the same. And it never will. Thanks for watching, everybody. Follow me on Twitter, add my Discord, and make sure you smash that fucking like button and smash that fucking sub button for my next video, calling women cunts in the hood prank. Seriously, you better like this fucking video. It took forever.